Imagine selling your house, not to buy a better one, not to move somewhere new, to buy a flower. Not even the flower itself, just a promise of a flower, a paper contract, a bulb still sitting in frozen ground. That is exactly what thousands of ordinary Dutch citizens did in the winter of 1636. And for a brief, delirious moment, it made them rich beyond imagination. Then it destroyed them. This is the story of Tulip Mania, the world's first financial bubble, the first time in recorded history that ordinary people collectively lost their minds over an asset, drove its price into the stratosphere, and then watched it collapse overnight. It happened in the most sophisticated, educated, financially advanced nation the world had ever seen. And it could happen again tomorrow. Stay with me, because this story is stranger, darker, and more relevant than you've ever been told. To understand Tulip Mania, you need to understand the world it was born into. The Dutch Republic in the early 1600s was unlike anything that had existed before. It was small, it had no king, it had almost no natural resources, and yet it was the richest, most powerful nation on earth. Amsterdam had become the financial capital of the world. Dutch merchants controlled more than half of all European maritime trade. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the first publicly traded corporation in history, and it was worth more than every other company in the world combined. The Dutch invented the modern stock market. They invented futures contracts. They invented short selling and leverage trading. They were financial geniuses. And financial geniuses, it turns out, are just as capable of spectacular stupidity as everyone else. Because when the tulip arrived in Holland, even the smartest minds in the world could not resist it. The tulip did not originate in Holland. It came from the mountains of Central Asia, from the wild hillsides of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where wild tulips had grown for thousands of years. The Ottoman Turks cultivated the tulip into an art form. To the Ottomans, the tulip was sacred. Sultans filled their gardens with them. Poems were written about them. The word tulip itself is believed to derive from the Turkish word for turban tulband because of the flower's distinctive shape. In 1554, the Holy Roman Emperor's ambassador to the Ottoman court, a man named Ogier Gieselinde, Busbek saw tulips growing in Constantinople and was transfixed. He sent bulbs back to Vienna. From Vienna, the flower spread to botanical gardens across Europe. By the 1590s, tulips had arrived in the Netherlands, cultivated by the botanist Carolus Clusius at the University of Leiden. Clusius tried to keep his tulip collection private. Visitors were not allowed to touch his bulbs. Someone broke in and stole them. And with that theft, the tulip entered the Dutch commercial market. History, sometimes, turns on a single act of greed. What made the tulip so extraordinary to European eyes was not just its beauty, it was its difference. European flowers at the time were modest things. Roses, violets, lilies lovely, yes, but familiar, predictable. The tulip was like nothing they had ever seen. Its petals were bold and geometric. Its colors were saturated, deep crimsons, vibrant oranges, imperial, purples. The bloom sat upright, proud, symmetrical, like it had been designed by an artist rather than grown by nature. And among all the varieties, one type stood above the rest: the broken tulip. Broken tulips displayed spectacular streaks and flames of contrasting color on their petals. White petals slashed with deep red, yellow petals edged in purple. No two were exactly alike. These broken patterns were completely unpredictable. You could plant a bulb and have no idea what color it would produce. No one knew why. Not yet. It would be centuries before scientists discovered the truth. The broken pattern was caused by a virus. A mosaic virus transmitted by aphids, silently infecting the bulbs, producing those extraordinary color mutations by accident. The rarest, most coveted flowers in the world, the ones that fortunes would be spent to obtain, were sick. By the 1620s, tulips had become the ultimate Dutch status symbol. The wealthy displayed them in their homes and gardens, the way we display luxury cars today. Owning the rarest varieties meant you were cultured, refined, and spectacularly rich. Tulip portraits, paintings of individual, named tulip varieties, were commissioned by wealthy collectors and hung in homes like family heirlooms. There are more portrait paintings of tulips from this era than portraits of human beings. Tulip cultivation became competitive. Breeders spent years trying to develop new varieties. The most sought after bulbs had names: Semper Augustus, Viceroy, Admiral van Enkhuizen, General Bull. These names carried weight, status, meaning. Owning a Semper Augustus was the equivalent, in 1630s Holland, of owning a private jet today. And like the private jet, it wasn't just about the flower. It was about what the flower said about you. That you had taste, that you had wealth, that you had arrived. It was the perfect storm, a beautiful object, artificially scarce, beloved by the social elite, in the hands of the world's most financially sophisticated market. The conditions for a bubble were already there. All it needed was one more ingredient. Let's talk about the Semper Augustus, because no single object better captures the madness of Tulip Mania than this one flower. The Semper Augustus was first recorded in 1623. It was white, with sweeping streaks of deep red running from base to tip, a pattern so perfect, so dramatic, that it looked like it had been painted by hand. There were never more than a dozen bulbs in existence at any given time. A single bulb of Semper Augustus was purchased in 1623 for 1,000 guilders. The average Dutch worker earned 150 guilders in an entire year. By 1625, the price had risen to 3,000 guilders. By 1,633, 5,500 guilders. By 1,637, 10,000 guilders. For comparison, a beautiful, fully furnished canal house in Amsterdam, in the most expensive city in the world, could be purchased in 1637 for approximately 10,000 guilders. One tulip, one house, the same price. And people were paying it, willingly, eagerly, because everyone believed the price would only go higher. That belief, that conviction, is the heartbeat of every bubble ever created. Until around 1634, the tulip market was largely confined to the wealthy. Serious collectors, professional growers, and wealthy merchants traded bulbs directly, physical flowers, changing hands at private sales. It was exclusive, expensive, and largely rational. Then greed began to widen the door. Wealthy Dutch investors had made fortunes through the VOC and the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. They understood speculation. They understood that assets could rise in value, and they saw tulip prices climbing year after year. They began buying bulbs, not to enjoy them, but to resell them. Buy a rare bulb in autumn, hold it through winter, sell in spring when collectors were desperate to plant. The profit margins were extraordinary. A merchant who bought a Viceroy bulb in 1634 for 3,000 guilders and sold it 6 months later for 4,200 guilders had made a 40% return. No stock, no ship voyage, no risk of storm or pirates. Just a bulb sitting in a box. Word spread. And where there is extraordinary profit, more people follow.
Here is where the Dutch financial genius becomes its own undoing. The tulip growing season created a problem for speculators. Bulbs were only available for purchase in summer, when they could be dug up for the rest of the year. Autumn, winter, spring, they were in the ground, growing, untouchable. You couldn't trade what you couldn't hold. Unless you invented a contract. Dutch merchants, the most sophisticated financial minds of their age, began writing futures contracts for tulip. Bulbs. A futures contract was simple. I agree to sell you this specific bulb from my garden when it is dug up next. Summer for a price we agree on today. These contracts were traded in taverns and coffee houses, the informal exchanges of the era. And this changed everything. Because now, you didn't need the actual bulb to participate in the tulip market. You just needed the contract. Contracts could be bought and resold dozens of times before the bulb ever left the ground. A bulb worth 100 guilders in September might pass through 10 different pairs of hands by January each. Buyer paying more than the last, with the actual flower sitting blissfully unaware in the cold Dutch soil. The tulip trade had detached from tulips. It had become pure speculation.
By late 1634, something unprecedented happened. The tulip market broke out of the merchant class entirely. Stories of spectacular profits spread through Dutch cities like fire. A weaver in Haarlem who had sold his loom to buy 3 bulbs and made more in 3 months than he had in 3 years. A chimney sweep who had traded a modest inheritance for a Viceroy contract and doubled his money overnight. People who had never traded anything in their lives began entering the market. Farmers sold livestock to buy contracts. Families sold furniture. Widows pledged their homes. Everyone had a friend who had made a fortune. Everyone believed they were not too late. This is the essential psychology of every bubble in history. The belief that this time is different, that the price will keep going up, that you are not a fool, you are an early adopter. By 1636, the tulip trade had spread to virtually every Dutch city. It had become a national obsession. Economists estimate that at the peak, over 10,000 people were actively trading tulip futures in a country of less than 2 million. The flower had become a religion, and everyone was a believer.
Before we get to the collapse, and trust me, the collapse is spectacular, make sure you hit that subscribe button on Collapsed Empire. Every week, we tell the complete story of the world's greatest empires, the greatest fortunes, and the greatest falls. This one is far from over. The winter of 1636 into 1637 was the peak of the madness. Trading volumes exploded. Prices doubled, then doubled again. Everyone was making money, or so it seemed. The market for certain rare varieties had become almost incomprehensible. The Viceroy bulb, not even the rarest variety, but highly sought, was trading for between 3,000 and 4,200 guilders in January 1637. A document survives from this period that lists what 4,200 guilders could otherwise buy: 8 fat pigs, 4 fat oxen, 12 fat sheep, 24 tons of wheat, 48 tons of rye, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 2 barrels of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed, with linens, a suit of clothes, 1 silver drinking cup. All of that for 1 bulb. And still people bought. Because in January 1637, the viceroy that sold for 3,000 guilders in November had already increased by 40%. If it continued at that rate, just continued, then by summer it would be worth 6,000. By the following winter, 12,000. On paper, it made perfect sense. Paper, of course, burns. At the very apex of the bubble, 1 flower stood above all others. The Semper Augustus, the eternal emperor. In January 1637, the owner of the only known collection of Semper Augustus bulbs, a wealthy Amsterdam merchant whose identity has been lost to history, refused to sell at any price. He knew what he had. Other collectors begged. They offered entire estates. They sent intermediaries with increasingly absurd sums. He refused them all. The mystery of his refusal, the very unavailability, only drove the price higher in the minds of buyers. We know from historical records that the last confirmed sale price of a Semper Augustus bulb in early 1637 was approximately 10,000 guilders. The equivalent, in today's money, is estimated at somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million US dollars. For 1 flower, 1 bulb, 1 contract on a bulb still sitting in frozen ground. There is a word for what the Dutch were experiencing in those final weeks. Euphoria. And as any doctor will tell you, euphoria is a symptom, not a state of health. It means something has gone dangerously wrong. By the height of the mania, very few people trading tulips had ever actually seen the bulbs they owned. This is critical to understanding the collapse. The futures contracts the paper promises to deliver bulbs at a future date had taken on a life entirely separate from the physical flowers. A bulb might be traded 50 times in a single winter while it sat, inert, in the earth. The buyers at the end of these chains were, in many cases, people with no ability to actually pay the final price. A weaver, earning 150 guilders a year, had signed a contract promising to pay 3,000 guilders for a bulb in the spring. He could not pay. He was betting that before spring arrived, before the contract came due, he could resell the contract to someone else at a profit. It was a chain. Every link depended on the link after it. You see the problem. If anyone in the chain couldn't find a buyer willing to pay more, every contract behind them was worthless. The entire market was a tower of promises, built on the assumption that prices would never stop rising. It was not a flower market anymore. It was a game of hot potato, and someone was about to get burned. There were warning signs. There always are. A few cooler heads in Amsterdam and Leiden had begun to quietly question the logic of the market. The prices bore no relationship to any underlying value. A tulip bulb produced 1 flower, 1 season. It could multiply into 2 or 3 bulbs over several years, but its commercial output was modest. There was no rational basis for a price of 3,000 guilders. Several Dutch writers published satirical pamphlets mocking tulip speculators. One described a fictional weaver who had sold his loom to buy contracts and was now living in a fine house until the market turned and he found himself penniless. and the fine house was just as imaginary as his paper wealth. The pamphlets were widely read and completely ignored because the people buying tulips were not buying on logic. They were buying on momentum, on social proof, on fear of missing out. Every person who got rich made the next person feel like a fool for not buying. And in a country where traders had been making rational decisions for decades, where the stock exchange and global shipping empires functioned with mathematical precision, no one wanted to be the cautious voice. No one wanted to be the person who missed the greatest trade of a generation. So they watched the warning signs pass like clouds and bought more contracts. The 3rd of February, 1637, Haarlem, Netherlands. The date that changed everything. A routine tulip auction was scheduled at a local tavern, the kind of event that had been occurring daily in dozens of Dutch cities for the past 2 years. The auctioneer placed the first lot on the table. He announced the opening price. He waited. Silence. He tried a lower price. Silence. Nobody bought. No record survives telling us exactly why this particular auction failed. Perhaps buyers had begun to sense the prices were too high. Perhaps some merchants had quietly started pulling back. Perhaps one influential buyer had decided to stay home that morning. We do not know the trigger. What we know is what happened next. Word spread from Haarlem to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Delft, from Delft to Utrecht and Rotterdam. The buyers had stopped. In a market built entirely on the belief that prices would always rise, that there would always be someone willing to pay more, the absence of buyers was not just a market problem. It was an existential crisis. The entire structure of the tulip trade had been a bet that the game would never end. The game had ended. Within 48 hours, panic had swept the Netherlands. Every holder of a tulip futures contract understood the same terrible truth simultaneously. If no one was buying, if the chain of greater fools had run out, then every contract they held was worth exactly what it said on the paper. Nothing. People who had bought contracts for 3,000 guilders tried to sell for 2,000. No buyers. They tried 1,000. Still no buyers. Within days, prices had collapsed by 90%. Within weeks, by 99%. A contract for a Viceroy bulb that had sold for 4,200 guilders in January was now trading when it could be traded at all for barely 50. 50 guilders. For what had been, just weeks earlier, a small fortune. The people who had sold their homes to buy contracts now had no home and no contract worth anything. The people who had sold their livelihoods, their tools, their animals, their businesses, had nothing left to return to. They had handed their lives to the tulip market, and the tulip market had handed nothing back. To understand how complete the collapse was, consider these documented numbers. A single bulb of common tulip varieties, not the rare Semper Augustus, just standard tradable varieties, had sold for 100 guilders at peak mania. After the crash, less than 1 guilder. A 99% loss. A futures contract on a top-tier variety, Viceroy, Admiral, General, had sold for thousands. After the crash, toilet paper. The contracts were, in many cases, legally unenforceable. Dutch courts were flooded with cases. Buyers refused to pay. Sellers refused to deliver. The government, overwhelmed and alarmed, eventually offered a partial solution. Contracts signed before November 1636 might be voided for a fee of 3.5% of the contract value. Contracts signed after which was the vast majority of them were simply cancelled. Cancelled. 3 years of frenzied trading, thousands of contracts, millions of guilders in promised payments. Just cancelled. As if it had never happened. Except for the people left holding the wreckage. For them, it had very much happened. The human cost of Tulip Mania is difficult to measure with precision. Contemporary accounts were often exaggerated. Later historians sometimes minimized the damage. The truth lies in between. The very wealthiest Dutch merchants, those who had entered the market early and exited before the peak, largely survived. Some even profited. They had the financial reserves to absorb losses, the intelligence to recognize when to sell, and the connections to navigate the legal chaos. The middle-class speculators, the tradespeople, the craftsmen, the modest merchants who had pledged their livelihoods fared far worse. Hundreds of families lost homes and businesses. Legal records from Amsterdam and Haarlem in 1637 and 1638 show dramatic spikes in debt proceedings and property forfeitures. One account from Haarlem describes a weaver who had sold his loom, his only means of income, to buy contracts. When the crash came, he had no contracts and no loom. He was left at middle age, with no tools, no savings, and no way to rebuild. He was not alone. For these people, the ordinary citizens who had believed the promises Tulip Mania was not a curiosity or an economic footnote. It was the destruction of everything they had built. The Dutch government's response to the collapse was, to put it charitably, confused. Initially, the authorities tried to honor the contracts. Buyers were obligated to pay. Sellers were obligated to deliver. This was quickly recognized as impossible. The buyers couldn't pay. The sellers often no longer had viable bulbs to deliver. The States of Holland, the governing body, issued a decree attempting to convert all outstanding contracts into options. Buyers could walk away from contracts by paying 10% of the contract value. Sellers refused to accept this. The decree was revised, changed, revised again. Eventually, in April 1637, the States of Holland essentially threw up its hands and declared the whole matter a private dispute between buyers and sellers, not a matter of contract law. In practical terms, this meant almost no one was legally compelled to honor their contracts. The market had evaporated. The contracts were void. The courts were overwhelmed with disputes they couldn't resolve. For the people ruined by the crash, there was no relief, no bailout, no government support. There was only the silence of empty hands and the cold Dutch winter. Every collapsed bubble has its winners. Tulip Mania was no different. The people who got rich were not the ones the stories typically celebrate. They were the early sellers. The men, and they were almost entirely men who had bought bulbs in 1632 or 1633, held them as prices began to rise, and then sold their entire holdings in 1635 or early 1636. Before the mania reached its peak, before the ordinary citizens flooded in, before the futures market went insane, these men, the professional growers, the established bulb merchants, the wealthy collectors who understood the flower business, recognized the signs of speculation and quietly exited. They left the contracts in the hands of people who understood neither the flower market nor the risks they were taking. There were also the tavern and coffeehouse owners who profited from the trading fees, the notaries who wrote the contracts, the printers who produced the trading pamphlets, the people who sold shovels in a gold rush. They are the silent winners of Tulip Mania, and they have their counterparts in every financial crisis since. Now let's be honest about something. Because history, like all good stories, gets exaggerated. The popular image of Tulip Mania, an entire nation going collectively insane, aristocrats throwing entire fortunes at flowers, a total economic collapse that crippled the Dutch Republic for generations, is somewhat embellished. Much of the most dramatic storytelling about Tulip Mania comes not from 1637, but from 1841, when the Scottish journalist Charles Mackay published Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, a book that became one of the most influential financial texts in history. Mackay's account was vivid, moralistic, and entertaining. It was also partly inaccurate. Modern economic historians, reviewing the actual Dutch records, have found that the crash was largely contained to a specific class of futures traders, not the entire Dutch economy. The Dutch Republic did not collapse. It continued to be the world's leading trading power for another half-century. The absolute worst prices recorded were for a tiny number of extraordinarily rare bulbs: the Simper, Augustus, the Viceroy. Most bulbs traded at far more modest sums. But here is what is absolutely true, and where the historians agree. For the ordinary citizens who entered the market at its peak, the weavers, the farmers, the craftsmen, the losses were very real and very devastating. The myth may be larger than the reality. The reality was still a catastrophe for thousands of real people. Here is why Tulip Mania matters far beyond one cold Dutch winter almost 400 years ago. It created the template. Every single financial bubble in the centuries since has followed the same pattern, step by step, beat by beat, with almost no deviation. Step 1. A genuinely new or desirable asset appears. Step 2. Wealthy early investors drive up the price. Returns are spectacular. Step 3. Word spreads. Middle-class and working-class investors flood in, driven by fear of missing out. Step 4. Prices decouple from any rational underlying value. A new justification is invented. This time is different. Step 5. Debt and leverage enter the market. People borrow to buy. Step 6. A trigger small, often random, causes a single failure of confidence. Step 7. Panic, cascade, collapse. Step 8. The early wealthy exit with their gains. The late ordinary investors bear the losses. South Sea Bubble, 1720. The same pattern. The Great Crash of 1929. The same pattern. The dot-com bubble, 2000. The same pattern. The housing market, 2008. The same pattern. Bitcoin, 2017. 2021. The same pattern. The tulip, it turns out, was not an anomaly. It was a warning, and humanity has never managed to heed it for more than one generation at a time. Why do we keep repeating the same mistake? Economists, psychologists, and historians have been asking this question for centuries. The answer is uncomfortable. Because the tulip buyers were not idiots. They were not fundamentally different from you or me. They were ordinary people in an extraordinary time of prosperity, watching people around them get rich and making a rational decision based on the information available to them. The prices have been rising for years. Every person I know who bought made money. The experts say the market is strong. Why would I be the fool who doesn't buy? This is the seductive logic of every bubble. It is not stupidity that drives people in. It is pattern recognition, one of the greatest tools in human cognition, applied to a system where the pattern is about to break. We are wired to learn from what has worked before. We are wired to follow the crowd. We are wired to believe that the extraordinary conditions we are living in are permanent. The tulip was beautiful. The human psychology it exploited is timeless. And until we understand that, really understand it, not just as a historical story, but as a warning about ourselves, the next bubble is already growing. Somewhere, right now, it is blooming. There is a beautiful irony in what became of the tulip. After the crash of the year 1637, the rare broken tulips, the Semper Augustus, the Viceroy, the flowers that had cost fortunes were largely forgotten. The virus that created their spectacular color patterns also weakened the bulbs, and over time, most of the famous broken varieties died out or were lost. The tulip survived. Of course it did. It was just a flower. Today, the Netherlands is the world's largest producer of tulips. 3 billion bulbs per year, exported to over 100 countries. A tulip bulb today costs between 1 and 5 euros. Not 10,000 guilders, not a canal house, not a weaver's loom and life savings. 1 euro. The most expensive flower in history is now sold by the bagful at garden centers. History has a sense of humor, even when it is a dark one. The Dutch Republic survived Tulip Mania. It would go on to dominate global trade for another 50 years. Amsterdam would remain the financial capital of the world well into the 18th century. But the crash left something behind, a scar in the collective memory of Dutch society, a lesson whispered from generation to generation. Do not trust the flower. Do not trust the price. Do not trust the crowd. Every empire, every civilization, every financial system, every golden age carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. Not always through war, not always through invasion or plague. Sometimes through nothing more dramatic than greed. Through the quiet, human conviction that this time is different, that the price will keep rising, that the bulb in the frozen ground is worth more than the house above it. It never is. If this story taught you something, if it made you think differently about the market headlines you read today, hit subscribe, because this is what Collapsed Empire is here for. Not just the battles, not just the conquests, the quiet moments when civilizations forget what they know and pay the price. Next on Collapsed Empire, the South Sea Bubble, how Britain's greatest Khan destroyed an empire. 100 years after the Dutch traded their homes for flowers, the British were trading them for shares in a company that had no ships, no trade routes, and no plan. The same greed, an even bigger crash. That story is waiting for you, right there on your screen. See you in the ruins.